It makes me feel guilty.
I can understand his raving now.
Oh, don't be silly.
Hollywood in the early 1930s was a glittering kingdom of dreams. But behind the dazzling lights lurked shadows darker than any silent film melodrama. At the very center of this contradiction stood Jean Harlow, the platinum blonde siren who embodied both innocence and raw sensuality. She was MGM's most luminous star, the woman who could make entire theaters gasp with just a sly smile or a toss of her famous pale hair. But in 1932, her life was thrust into the darkest scandal Hollywood had ever seen, one that still haunts the industry nearly a century later. The tragedy began not on a film set, but inside the secluded Beverly Hills home she shared with her new husband, Paul Bern. On September 5th, 1932, just 2 short months after their wedding, Bern was found dead in their mansion, a single gunshot wound to the head. A suicide note, cryptic and chilling, left behind on the table, and it devastated Jean Harlow, suddenly caught in a storm of rumors, half-truths, and whispered conspiracies. The press devoured the story. Was Bern a tortured man who took his own life? Or was something far more sinister at play: murder, betrayal, or even a cover-up by the mighty MGM studio desperate to protect their most valuable star? Almost immediately, speculation swirled that Jean herself had played a role, that perhaps her overwhelming beauty and rising fame had broken the fragile spirit of the man she married. Others whispered that Bern had a secret past, one filled with shadowy entanglements and forbidden relationships, a past that had finally caught up with him. The suicide note only added fuel to the fire. "Dearest dear," it began, "unfortunately, this is the only way to make good the frightful wrong I have done you, and to wipe out my abject humiliation. I love you, Paul. You understand that last night was only a comedy." These words, puzzling and poetic, raised more questions than answers. What humiliation? What comedy? And why, if his love for Jean was so strong, had he chosen to end his life only weeks into their marriage? For Jean, the scandal was devastating. She was only 21 years old, a woman still carving her place in Hollywood, and suddenly she became the unwilling centerpiece of a tabloid frenzy. The tragedy of Paul Bern's death threatened to eclipse her career and tarnish her image. Yet MGM's executives moved swiftly, spinning the story, shielding their star, and ensuring that no detail could fully unravel the mystery. Even now, historians and film lovers debate the truth. Was Bern's death really a suicide? Was Jean Harlow an innocent victim of circumstance? Or did she know far more than she ever revealed? The scandal remains a tangled knot of love, lies, and loss, one of the most enduring Hollywood mysteries of all time. And to understand how such a tragedy unfolded, we must look beyond the shocking headlines, back into the lives of the two people at its center: Jean Harlow, the golden girl of the silver screen, and Paul Bern, the troubled man who became her ill-fated husband. Long before their names were linked in one of Hollywood's darkest scandals, Jean Harlow and Paul Bern came from vastly different worlds. Their early years shaped who they were, and perhaps also sealed their tragic fate. Jean Harlow was born Harlean Harlow Carpenter in 1911 Inches, Kansas City, Missouri. She was the cherished daughter of a socially ambitious mother, Jean Bellow, who dreamed of high society and glittering stages. Jean's childhood was marked by instability. Her parents divorced when she was young, and her mother, determined to escape the confines of Middle America, pushed her daughter toward Hollywood. At first, Jean resisted. She was shy, more interested in blending into the background than standing out. But Hollywood had a way of finding its stars, and soon her natural beauty, especially her striking pale hair and mischievous smile, drew attention. By her late teens, Jean was appearing in small film roles. At first, she was just another pretty face, but in 1930, her career exploded. Cast as a vamp in Howard Hughes' Hell's Angels, she became an overnight sensation. The press dubbed her the Platinum Blonde, and audiences couldn't get enough. She was alluring but approachable, scandalous yet sweet, an intoxicating contradiction that made her unique among the rising starlets of the time. But behind the glamour, Jean was still so young, barely in her 20s, and already navigating fame, failed marriages, and relentless public scrutiny. Paul Bern's path could not have been more different. Born Paul Levy in 1889 Germany, he immigrated with his family to the United States as a child. Unlike Jean, who stumbled into fame, Paul worked his way up quietly, behind the camera rather than in front of it. He became a respected figure in Hollywood, known not as a star, but as a writer, director, and most importantly, a production executive at MGM. He was a man of intellect, admired for his sharp mind and his ability to shape stories. But there was also a fragility to Paul. He struggled with insecurity about his height, his appearance, and his relationships. Friends described him as gentle and kind, but also melancholy, even haunted. By the early 1932, their worlds collided. Jean was the shining new face of MGM, a sensation that promised millions at the box office. Paul was one of the studio's trusted insiders, a man who helped shepherd productions and nurtured talent. To some, their pairing seemed improbable. She was a vivacious young starlet, just 21, while he was over 40, reserved, and battle-worn from years in the business. But others believed it made sense. Paul was thoughtful, steady, and cultured, the very qualities Jean's chaotic life lacked. For Jean, whose personal life had already been marred by a short-lived teenage marriage and constant press intrusion, Paul seemed like a safe harbor. Yet beneath the surface, there were cracks. Jean's career was skyrocketing, and MGM was determined to protect their golden asset. Paul, for all his intellect, was not a powerful leading man, but rather a studio figure overshadowed by the moguls above him. And there were whispers about Paul's past relationships, about his fragile ego, and about private troubles he carried with him long before Jean entered the picture. When they married in July 1932, Hollywood took notice. The press painted it as a love story, the glamorous blonde bombshell and the thoughtful executive, opposites who had found balance in each other. But friends and colleagues raised eyebrows. Some said Jean seemed uncertain, that she married Paul more out of a need for stability than deep passion. Others suggested that Paul, insecure and aging, was intoxicated by the idea of being the husband of the most desired woman in America. Their union lasted only 2 months before it was shattered by tragedy. But to understand why the marriage ended so abruptly and why Paul Bern's death remains one of Hollywood's great mysteries, we must first look at how love began to blossom between two people who, on the surface, had little in common, but who were drawn together in a swirl of glamour, insecurity, and longing. Hollywood in the early 1932 was not just a workplace, it was a fever dream. Parties spilled out of mansions, stars mingled with moguls, and every whispered romance had the potential to make headlines. In that glittering but cutthroat world, the bond between Jean Harlow and Paul Bern took root, fragile yet strangely magnetic. Their first real connection grew not under the spotlight, but in the quieter corners of MGM. Paul, with his background as a writer and executive, often worked behind the scenes, shaping projects and advising young talent. Jean, meanwhile, was still learning the ropes of stardom. Despite her explosive rise after Hell's Angels, she lacked the formal training of many of her peers. Paul recognized both her vulnerability and her potential. He treated her not just as a box office commodity, but as a person. In the often predatory studio system, that small kindness mattered. Friends later recalled how Paul seemed to admire Jean with a mixture of awe and protectiveness. He was decades older, soft-spoken, and thoughtful, everything the brash young Hollywood crowd was not. Jean, who had already been through a short-lived teenage marriage and the constant pressures of fame, seemed drawn to his stability. With Paul, there was no competition, no need to play the glittering star. She could be Harlow again, the girl behind the platinum mask. Their courtship was quiet, almost surprisingly so given Jean's celebrity. They dined at intimate restaurants, avoided the wild parties, and shared long conversations rather than camera flashes. Paul was rumored to shower Jean with letters, thoughtful, sometimes melancholic notes that revealed his insecurities as well as his devotion. He often called her his anchor, the one who gave meaning to a life that otherwise felt adrift. To the outside world, Their romance appeared improbable. What could the 21-year-old goddess of Hollywood possibly see in a 42-year-old executive with thinning hair and a reputation for melancholy? Yet those who knew Jean best say she craved exactly what Paul offered: seriousness, loyalty, and the promise of a life less turbulent. In a world where producers and directors saw her as a golden ticket, Paul saw her as a human being. Still, the balance of their relationship was uneven. Paul gave Jean emotional support, but in many ways, she was the one carrying him. He was sensitive to whispers about his masculinity, his ability to satisfy her, even his role in her career. Some biographers suggest that Jean's growing fame made Paul feel small, inadequate, even emasculated. While Jean tried to reassure him, these insecurities would later feed into the tragedy that followed. Their wedding on the 2nd of July, 1932, was sudden and, to many, shocking. The press described it as romantic, a whirlwind decision born of passion. But behind the glowing headlines, some friends sensed hesitation. Jean, still so young, seemed unsure. Paul, meanwhile, was euphoric. His letters and public comments reflected a man who believed he had finally secured love, legitimacy, and purpose. The honeymoon period, however, was short-lived. Within weeks, cracks began to show. Paul's insecurities deepened, while Jean's career demands grew heavier. MGM was working her relentlessly, pushing her from one project to the next, and the studio executives had little patience for personal distractions. Paul, accustomed to being the quiet mentor, now found himself overshadowed by his wife's stardom. Yet for a brief, flickering moment, there was tenderness. Photographs from that summer showed Jean smiling beside Paul, radiant in white gowns or laughing in candid shots. In those moments, it seemed possible that love could bridge their differences. But Hollywood is rarely kind to fragile unions. Theirs was a marriage built on uneven ground. Jean, the rising comet no one could slow down, and Paul, the introspective man whose doubts gnawed at him in silence. Their love story began like a gentle melody in a noisy, chaotic world. But soon, the noise grew louder, the shadows deeper, and the melody would be drowned out by scandal. The marriage of Jean Harlow and Paul Bern began with hope, but within weeks, their differences started to show in painful ways. Jean was only 21. She was at the peak of her youth, beautiful, adored, and under immense pressure from MGM. The studio worked her constantly, moving her from one set to another. Fame was not just glamour, it was exhausting labor. Jean spent long hours under hot lights, repeating scenes again and again, then rushing to premieres and interviews. For her, marriage was supposed to be a safe space. But Paul, though kind, often brought more tension than comfort. Paul was 42. He was thoughtful, cultured, but also deeply insecure. His colleagues at MGM respected his mind, yet he was not a powerful mogul. He was not Irving Thalberg, nor Louis B. Mayer. Next to Jean's star power, Paul sometimes felt invisible. Friends noticed his sadness. He worried that he could not live up to his young wife's needs emotionally, socially, or physically. Arguments began to creep into their private life. Jean was outgoing and spirited. Paul was quiet, often brooding. When Jean returned from the studio late at night, she wanted laughter, release, and lightness. Paul, on the other hand, sought reassurance. He wanted her to stay home, to be a calming presence, not a whirlwind of Hollywood attention. Whispers spread through MGM about their troubles. Some insiders claimed Paul had confided in friends that he feared he could not satisfy Jean. Others suggested that Jean felt trapped, marrying too young, too quickly, to a man she barely knew. Behind closed doors, tensions built like storm clouds. Adding to the strain were outside forces. Jean's mother, known as Mama Jean, had always been a strong presence in her life. She was protective, ambitious, and skeptical of Paul. She feared he was too fragile for her daughter, too consumed by his insecurities. This interference only deepened Paul's feelings of inadequacy. Paul's own past also returned to haunt him. Rumors surfaced of a former common-law wife, Dorothy Millette, a troubled woman who still lingered in his life. Whether Paul felt guilt, responsibility, or lingering attachment, It was clear that his past weighed heavily on his new marriage. Some believed this unresolved relationship was the shadow that followed him into his union with Jean. The tension between Jean and Paul was not explosive in the way of violent fights. Instead, it was quiet, gnawing, and deeply psychological. Paul's despair, combined with Jean's need for freedom and MGM's control over her every move, created a toxic atmosphere. Two people who cared for each other were being crushed by forces far bigger than themselves: fame, insecurity, and the relentless machine of Hollywood. By late August 1932, only weeks after their wedding, Paul seemed increasingly unwell. Friends described him as withdrawn, nervous, and consumed by self-doubt. Jean, meanwhile, was busy on set, caught between her rising stardom and the private strain at home. The pressure built to a breaking point, and soon, on a warm September evening, the tragedy that would shock Hollywood forever was set into motion. The night of September 5th, 1932, still lingers in Hollywood's memory like a ghost. It was the night when the quiet insecurities of Paul Bern erupted into a tragedy so chilling, it forever marked Jean Harlow's life. The day began in silence. Paul had been restless for weeks. Those close to him spoke of a man carrying invisible chains, fear of inadequacy, whispers of his troubled past, the haunting presence of Dorothy Millette, the woman he had once lived with. For Paul, the glamorous marriage to Hollywood's brightest star had not brought peace. It had magnified every doubt, every shadow. That evening, inside the secluded Beverly Hills mansion, the walls felt heavy with tension. Jean was not there. She had spent the day away, leaving Paul alone with his thoughts. Some say he paced the halls endlessly. Others believe he wrote, paused, tore up letters, and wrote again. What is certain is that, by nightfall, Paul had made a decision he believed would end his torment. On a small table, he left a note. Just a few lines, but they cut like a knife. Dearest dear, unfortunately, this is the only way to make good the frightful wrong I have done you, and to wipe out my abject humiliation. I love you, Paul. You understand that last night was only a comedy. The words were strange, cryptic, almost theatrical. What wrong was he referring to? What humiliation had consumed him so completely? The final sentence, last night was only a comedy, would forever puzzle historians. Was it about intimacy, an argument, or something darker? Moments later, the stillness of the mansion shattered with the sound of a single gunshot. Paul Bern, Hollywood executive, husband of Jean Harlow, was gone. When Jean returned home and discovered the scene, her world collapsed. Imagine the shock. A young woman just 21, stepping into her house only to find her husband lifeless, blood marking the end of a story that had barely begun. In an instant, the glow of Hollywood's stardom turned into the cold glare of tragedy. The scandal exploded. Newspapers the next morning screamed with headlines: suicide, betrayal, humiliation. The words filled every front page, and with every headline, Jean's name was dragged deeper into the storm. Some accused her outright, whispering that the young starlet had broken her husband's spirit. Others painted her as a victim, too innocent to see the darkness she had married. And then came the rumors that refused to die. Whispers that MGM had staged a cover-up, that Paul's death was not suicide at all, but murder to protect Jean, to protect the studio's millions invested in her shining career. Some claimed the body had been moved, that evidence had been hidden, that the note itself was part of a desperate script written by the most powerful men in Hollywood. Jean herself fell into silence. She never spoke publicly about the note, nor about the final hours of Paul's life. MGM quickly whisked her back onto film sets, wrapping her in layers of protection, shielding her from reporters. On screen, she sparkled brighter than ever. But off screen, she carried the heavy shadow of that night for the rest of her short life. The breaking point was not just Paul Bern's death. It was the shattering of illusions, the illusion of a safe marriage, the illusion of stability, the illusion that Hollywood's brightest stars were untouchable by darkness. In truth, behind the lights and the glamour, the pain was all too human. That gunshot was more than the end of Paul Bern. It was the beginning of a mystery that would never truly be solved. The day after Paul Bern's body was discovered, Hollywood was no longer a dream factory. It was a crime scene. Reporters swarmed the gates of Jean Harlow's mansion, their cameras clicking like machine guns. Flashbulbs blinded the night as neighbors whispered through hedges. The story was too sensational to resist. The platinum blonde goddess, barely out of girlhood, now at the center of a death mystery. MGM, the most powerful studio in Hollywood, moved with ruthless speed. Their star could not be destroyed by scandal, not when millions were tied to her films. Within hours, studio executives descended on the house. Some accounts insist they arrived before the police, ordering staff to clean up the scene, to remove anything that might tarnish Jean's image. If Paul Bern had secrets, they would be buried with him. The official ruling was suicide. The note was presented as proof, its strange words left to hang like unanswered riddles. But the public was not convinced. Gossip spread faster than the ink on the morning papers. Was Jean responsible? Did Paul discover something unbearable about his new bride? Or worse, had someone else been in the house that night? And then came the most chilling twist. Dorothy Millette. Only 2 days after Paul's death, the body of Dorothy, Paul's troubled former partner, was found in the Sacramento River. She had drowned herself. For many, this was no coincidence. Dorothy had been financially supported by Paul for years. Some speculated that she had visited him on the night of his death, that their reunion had ended in despair. Others believed she knew too much, and her death silenced her forever. The whispers became shouts. Was it possible Paul's suicide note had been addressed to Dorothy, not Jean? Had MGM blurred the truth to protect their shining star? Theories multiplied, each darker than the last. Jean, meanwhile, was caught in the middle of a storm she could not control. At 21, she faced reporters demanding answers, lawyers circling like vultures, and a public divided between sympathy and suspicion. Her grief was real. Friends recalled her pale, trembling face, her refusal to eat, her sudden weight loss. Yet she was also forced back to work almost immediately. MGM believed the best defense was distraction. Put Jean back on screen, let the audience fall in love with her again, and the scandal would fade. But for Jean, the pain did not fade. She wore it like an invisible veil. Behind every smile in her films of that era lay the shadow of Paul Bern's death. In private, she avoided the subject, never publicly discussing the details, never correcting the rumors. Her silence spoke volumes. Legally, the case closed quickly. Suicide, they declared, and the matter was dropped. No trial, no grand jury, no scandalous courtroom drama. Just a young widow pressed back into the Hollywood machine. But in the court of public opinion, the trial never ended. Theories lived on in whispers, in newspaper columns, in books written decades later. To this day, many believe the truth was never told, that Jean Harlow was protected by MGM's iron grip, and that Paul Bern's death was far more than what the studio claimed. For Jean, survival came at a cost. She remained Hollywood's brightest star, but her innocence was gone. Every glance, every photograph carried with it a ghost. And the public, though fascinated, never fully let her escape the shadows of that September night. The story of Jean Harlow and Paul Bern is more than a scandal. It is a reminder of how fragile human hearts can be, even under the brightest lights of Hollywood. Jean was only 21 when she lost her husband in the most shocking way possible. She was not just a movie star then, she was a young woman, alone, bewildered, and thrust into a storm she never asked for. The cameras captured her beauty, but they could never capture the weight she carried inside. For Paul Bern, the tragedy was the final act of a life filled with doubt. He was intelligent, sensitive, and kind, yet consumed by insecurities that fame could not soothe. His marriage to Jean may have felt like salvation, but it also magnified his fears until they became unbearable. His final note, still haunting after all these years, reveals a man caught between love and despair, comedy and humiliation, life and death. And then there is Hollywood itself, the silent third character in this story, a place where dreams are manufactured, but also where truths are hidden, altered, or erased. MGM worked tirelessly to protect Jean, to polish the story, to ensure their star remained untarnished. But the cost of that protection was secrecy. And secrecy always leaves behind questions. Nearly a century later, we still ask, did Paul truly take his own life? What role did Dorothy Millette play in those final hours? And how much did Jean really know? We may never have the answers. The mystery has become part of the legend, a ghost forever tied to Jean's golden image. Jean Harlow went on to make more films, to captivate millions, but she never escaped the shadow of that September night. She died young herself, at just 26, her life cut short before she could tell her own story. Perhaps that is why the scandal of Paul Bern endures, because it is not just about death, but about silence, a silence that still echoes like a gunshot in the dark across the history of Hollywood.